day. The good news is today that the wood burner has gone on for the first time. So if we switch around it a little bit, we can see that my dog is very, very happy. And I'll probably have to open the window in a minute because it's so hot. You can see my cheeks are a bit red because I've been crying because of the poem that my sister wrote, which you've probably seen or not seen maybe. I didn't do my clip last night because honestly Nick was on a work call and it was so boring that it made me fall asleep. By the time I woke up, couldn't even string a sentence together. So today's a difficult day for two reasons. It's the day before Billy's birthday, so the day before anything. If you've lost anyone or you've had any kind of big event that's affected you in life, the day before, the build up, the anticipation, I think it's just your body's natural reaction. I think in this instance it's a little bit different because the day before Billy's birthday is the day that we found out that he had passed away. So remember it clear as mud. 11:05 was my midwife appointment. Midwife I'd never seen before. She was very nice. 11:55 thereabouts was my scan, by which point we had found out that we'd lost Billy. So today has got as many triggers as tomorrow. Tomorrow I find more peace with that day than today. Today feels very much more anxious. So I'm not going to dwell too much on today and tomorrow and how that affects our house, because that's just something that we deal with year in, year out. What I'm going to talk about is the trauma that losing a child causes a family, particularly the woman in the situation, because they've got to go through the birth and the hormones and the emotion. And in my particular case, there was trauma because I had preeclampsia. I then became extremely unwell with something called HELP syndrome, which, put in context, is quite rare for the hospital I was at. I think at the time the hospital I was at delivered like 3,000 babies a year, and they maybe had one case of HELP syndrome a year. So it was not something that certainly they were familiar with or looking for the signs of on a regular basis. Preeclampsia was kind of a run-of-the-mill complication. Most of the time it worked out okay. There were indicators that could be managed. It often wasn't something that quite quickly needed or quite quickly went downhill, whereas HELP syndrome, which developed around 1 a.m, something like that. And this is what I mean about trauma, because I was by this point heavily sedated, which results in Nick shouting at Florence because she's got out of bed. HELP syndrome. So obviously I'd been admitted to hospital because of my blood pressure, because Billy had passed away, because they weren't quite sure what was going to happen. They admitted me to hospital. The decision to admit me to hospital saved my life, in my opinion, because that meant they were monitoring what was going on with my blood and looking for eclampsia symptoms that I was going to go into seizure from the preeclampsia. Pre means obviously before. Eclampsia is when you have seizures, and HELP syndrome goes one further, and basically you can die from it. You can also die from preeclampsia, but that's much less common. So preeclampsia is the protein, in summary, the protein and the high blood pressure HELLP syndrome is very different in the fact that your liver, or in this case my liver and my kidneys, had started to shut down. My blood platelets had dropped so low that there was a risk of me bleeding to death, because my blood would not be able to clot if there was some kind of bleed during birth, anything, if I hemorrhaged. And it was an extremely dangerous situation. Now, of course, I was oblivious to all of this at the time. I remember somebody nice doctor coming into my room at about 10 o'clock at night. At this point, HELLP hadn't been diagnosed. I was preeclampsia, being monitored. I'd had all the kind of induction protocol invoked, and I was just, in bed, and I couldn't get sleep. There's a part of the brain that no medication can get to, particularly when you're going through trauma, which makes it extremely difficult to help anybody in that situation. So I couldn't sleep, I was irritable, I was erratic, and I always I always get a bit of anxiety when I say the word erratic, because I always think I'm going to confuse it with erotic, which is a very different meaning. Erratic. So they decided that they were going to give me some kind of sedation to just help me get a peaceful night before I was obviously going to deliver my baby. Peaceful night didn't turn out peaceful, but we weren't to know that. So I remember a doctor coming about 10 o'clock. I was not in a good place. The nurse that was monitoring me, the midwife, said, can we give her something to help her? They'd given me diamorphine and all the normal kind of stuff, and he looked at me and he said, I think we should give her something ending with PAM. And drugs ending with PAM have been a reoccurring theme over the last 10 years. Not consistently, I'm not addicted, but I have come to partake in a few, what would you call it, experiences, diazepam being the main one. When you're in hospital, you're much more in a controlled situation. I think I was diazepam, I was all pammed out. So I got to a point where I managed to kind of drop off to sleep. Maybe it was 1 o'clock, something like that, in the morning. And then the last thing I remember clearly is honestly maybe 5 or 6 doctors, and bearing in the middle of the night, you don't have a huge amount of doctors around at night, but there were a lot of doctors in the room. There were a lot of trolleys being pushed around. There were a lot of cannulas being put in all kinds of places, in my arms, in my legs. I think there was one in my ankle at one point. I remember the registrar shouting, your condition's deteriorated, it's extremely dangerous, you've got HELLP syndrome. I didn't have a clue, I'd never even heard of HELLP syndrome. I thought that just meant I needed some kind of help. You've got HELLP syndrome, we need to get your baby out as fast as we can, because that's the only way that the body recovers. HELLP syndrome is directly connected with pregnancy and the placenta and being pregnant. It's not something you can get if you're not pregnant. And the only way to improve the successful outcome of the mother is to induce get the baby out ASAP. So they gave me a lot of drugs to induce labour as fast as possible. still dealing with Mother Nature. Don't remember much after that. I remember I remember maybe 8 a.m, 9 a.m, something like that. I requested an epidural because I could feel contractions, and I didn't really want to be in a position where I was feeling all the natural things associated with labour. And I remember then Nick was there with me. I remember the first person to arrive was my brother Mark with Linda, and then quite shortly after that all my other brothers and sisters arrived. I've got 2 brothers, 2 sisters, and my mum, of course, my rock. So they sped up labour as quickly as possible. I remember I started pushing at 12. Felt like I was pushing forever. Morphined up to my eyeballs, because obviously they can give you whatever you want, because they know that there's going to be no effect on the baby. So they just kept me jacked up on sedation and morphine. And Billy was born at 2:15 in the afternoon, but it was silent. And I think up until that point, you kind of think that someone somewhere might have just made a mistake. You kind of know, your logical brain tells you there's no way that they've made a mistake. But the point that you can feel that your baby's been born and it's silent, can't really say anything about that. Nothing to describe it. Then, of course, there's the trauma, because I wasn't better. My kidneys weren't responding, my liver wasn't responding to the treatment. There were 3 consultants in on a Saturday. One of them, my consultant, Mr. Lucas, who was head of the unit, and I kind of pieced together that if all of these consultants were in on a Saturday afternoon, then it must be pretty bad. And I remember my mum saying to Mr. Lucas, Mr. Lucas, like, I've known him for a long time. I've been seeing him since I was 18. And obviously my mum's been to appointments with me. She knows him just as well as I do. I remember my mum saying, now that Billy's been born, she's gonna get better. She's gonna get better. And he turned around to her and he said, she's nowhere near out of the woods yet. And up until that point, I'd kind of thought, I don't care if I live or whether I die. I remember just before Billy was born, the midwife was shouting that I needed to breathe and all kinds, and I was shouting back at her. I didn't want to breathe. I didn't want to be alive. And then I just recall this conversation that was not even next to me in earshot of the consultant saying, basically, my mum's like saying, wanting reassurance, she's going to be okay, and the doctor's going, she's nowhere near out of the woods, it's not looking good. And I thought, and I need to pull myself together here, because the pain that I'm feeling from losing my baby I can't inflict that on my own mum. So because of all the drugs that I was on, because of all the black spots in memory, of the memories, I suffer terribly at this time of year from post-traumatic stress disorder. And I used to struggle with it all year round. And how it manifests with me pretty much is at night time. So anyone that knows me knows that I go through periods of just pure insomnia, and I kind of joke about it. But the reason that it happens, and you know, I've spent way too much money on counselling trying to get through it, and I've gotten to a point where most of the time it only affects me at this time of year, the post-traumatic stress part of it. And the main reason is because I was so sedated, I've got no clarity of memory. I've been through trauma recall with 3 different therapists, which is how you're meant to get to a point where you can manage the trauma. Clearly it's done something, because I only get it this time of year, but what it does, I go to sleep, I get flashbacks, pretty horrific flashbacks, of bits that I can't remember. Sometimes bits that I can remember, a lot of the time it's parts that I can't remember, and obviously it's deep rooted in my brain somewhere. And because I was so sedated, and because obviously it's so traumatic, your brain blocks things out, and at some point it's got to come out. So I don't think anyone acknowledges that, or maybe not anyone, I don't think it is acknowledged enough with regards to how mothers, maybe fathers as well, but I can only speak on my behalf, are affected by post-traumatic stress disorder when they go through stillbirth. And ironically, it's something that's come up quite recently, in the last couple of months, about mental health support post stillbirth, and it not being good enough in the UK. You know, you kind of given a few options, and you're meant to kind of find a way to get better yourself. It's not easy. The other thing that I want to talk about that I've really struggled with since losing Billy, and this one will only be short, promise, is I think they apply labels to everything these days, but it's called GAD for short, and it's generalised anxiety disorder. Now, even before all this, I was a worrier. I was a born worrier. So, you know, it was kind of inevitable that I would struggle at some point, you know, with anxiety. And again, I've spent way too much money with various different counsellors to try and figure out the best way of coping. And generally, I've got pretty okay coping mechanisms. Nick would probably disagree, but I get by, and the only I would get frustrated that I couldn't get to a point where I was at an acceptable level where I could function with my anxiety. I would get frustrated that I couldn't get better, or, you know, get myself better, or because anyone with anxiety knows that most of it's not logical. It's just completely illogical. And I would say the one comment that hit home with my counsellor, one of my counsellors, I've had a fair few, she said, you know, most people go through life and they have ups and downs, and they have difficulties that they have to overcome, and, you know, sometimes they can invoke having to deal with an anxiety disorder. There's quite a few different variants of it, I think. And she said to me, you dealt with one of the most extreme things that anybody could ever have to deal with, and that is the loss of a child. She said, so in the terms of life, the worst thing that could possibly happen to you as a woman has already happened. You've lost your child. Your child has died. And therefore, it heightens the risk around everything else that goes on in your life, because the worst thing has already happened. It means there's a possibility that all those other things could happen, because you know, and that kind of made sense at that point and allowed me to process it in a different way. I'm still anxiety ridden, and have coping mechanisms that sometimes don't work, but we've all got our issues. So before I finish my clip for tonight, which has gone on way too long, so I'm going to count it. I don't know if I can count it as a double clip, considering I forgot last night. Quite recently, I had a conversation, and it's probably not. I don't want anyone to think, oh, was that conversation with me? Was it me that said that, or was it something that I said? This is not aimed at anybody in particular. I just want it to be my parting comment for tonight's clip. So, my little boy was full term, 38 weeks and 5 days. So, if you have ever given birth, you'll know the minute that you hold your baby, the minute that you look at them, you see them all snuggled up in a blanket, you smell them, you know, you just don't want to let go of them. That was no different for me. The only difference was that my baby did not cry. So, for me, I often feel like the term stillbirth or my baby was born sleeping, people don't understand or grasp the gravity of it. So, you know, I said to somebody recently, before we had the girls, we had a little boy, and sadly, you know, we lost him. He passed away. And the person said, oh gosh, that must have been awful. What happened? I said, oh, it was a stillbirth. And straight away, his response and his body language changed, as though I interpreted it. Like if I had said, oh, we lost him after, you know, he lived for 6 hours and then we lost him, I think that would have got a different response than me saying he was stillborn. And I think some of that around is education, some of that is around stillbirth being a taboo. But if you're ever around anybody that has given birth to a baby at full term, they have effectively gone through the same as any other mum who has been given their baby to hold for the first time. They just don't cry. It's that simple. If I close my eyes now, and I'll probably wake up in the night, often when I'm out running or on my own, I'll catch a smell, and it's Billy's smell. We all get that. We all know what our newborn babies smell like, and I still have that smell with me. So that would just be my finishing for tonight. I'm going to bed, probably not to sleep very much. and I hope everyone is enjoying the cooler weather and their log burners, although I know most people near me can't have them because of some random environmental government, I don't know. But I'm outside of that zone, so I've got my log burner.